right, so good morning, everybody. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, the digital education partner of the Toronto Zoo. And I am pleased to be back over the summer series of programs with the Climate Action Learning and Leadership team run all summer long at the zoo. It's an amazing cohort of incredible youth working to understand and learn about climate change, its impacts, how they can help make positive solutions, and do much, much more. So thank you for continuing to join us. If you've joined in for one of our other past programs, we've got 2 more coming up over the course of August, and I hope you get the chance to join in for those as well. Right now, we are broadcasting live to the Toronto Zoo and to the Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants YouTube channel, so welcome in wherever you happen to be joining from, or live, of course, at the zoo itself. Now, it is a really, really interesting time in the world, in that most of the world is on fire, it seems. Alongside that, here in Ontario, it is a very scary 40 degrees Celsius with the humidex, which is way, way too hot, so if I end up drenched in sweat throughout the presentation, consider that a physical manifestation of climate change in action. We, of course, also had the UN report on climate change come out just yesterday, I believe it was, or 2 days ago. Pretty dire report, and some of you may have heard of that, whether you're joining live or on YouTube, and I'm sure we'll get the chance to talk about that as well. So, without further ado, diving in today with our amazing speaker, we are joined by Dr. Kim Cobb. So she is joining us from Georgia Tech. Her work has taken her all over the world to understand the impacts and causes of man-made climate change and climate change throughout the ages, and some of the things that we can do to help mitigate it. Her education work has been widely lauded around the world. She's one of the best speakers we've ever had on at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, and so I'd love to bring her in today. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Cobb. And yes, if you'd like to dive in, take us away, showcase some of your work, and we can touch on some cool questions at the end, it's lovely to have you.
Oh, great. Well, thanks so much for having me, Jesse, again, and for all those kind words. And it's really a treat to speak to y'all at the Toronto Zoo today and to share a little bit about the research that I've done in climate change, but also put it into the broader context of what the world just learned yesterday with the drop of the new IPCC report. And so lots to talk about. And don't worry, the beginning part may be a little bit grim, but the back end will be full of really actionable information to help people get engaged in solutions. So stay tuned for that, right? We have to get through the front matter first, if you will. And that is indeed a little bit grim. So first of all, I love starting with this graphic. It's a beautiful graphic. It's featured all over the report that just dropped yesterday, and it's just an artistic rendition of the history of global average temperatures over the last 100 and so years, and you can see that it's warming quite rapidly right now, with the record still just barely hanging on in 2016 as the warmest year ever on record, and 2020 just almost beat it. And 2021 also likely going to land in the top 5 warmest years ever. And so 2016 was a particularly unusual year, and I'm going to spend a minute talking about it because it was really ramped up in terms of temperatures by a natural climate cycle called the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And this is a kind of a rendering from NASA data of the El Nino event of 2016. And you can see that it reorganizes the entire Pacific Ocean, which is pretty important because the Pacific Ocean covers about half of our planet, as you can see from that view of our planet. And so from the centrally eastern Pacific, sea surface temperatures rise up to 5 or 6 degrees Celsius, and they stay that way in this case for 10 long months. This El Nino gripped the entire tropical belt of the Pacific and caused weather patterns to change around the world, which is why people like me have been working for decades to try to understand the history of this natural cycle, and most importantly, whether it's being impacted by rising greenhouse gases and ongoing climate change. So this is me in my favorite place in the world, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, right in the heart of the El Nino zone at an island called Christmas Island. And I'm drilling a coral core from a colony that is about 50, 60 years old, and pulling out this core, which contains a a year by year by year archive of past ocean temperatures. And through analysis here in my lab at Georgia Tech, we can actually extract a very detailed history of monthly temperatures every 1 millimeter down this core across the entirety of its growth. So using material like this, we can learn how to read this amazing rock record for climate and ocean extremes in this area. And then by taking this archive back in time, centuries to millennia, we can actually determine a really incredible baseline for the past history of this climate cycle, and indeed whether it's changing today. And I don't want to steal my own thunder too much. I don't want to go into it too much here, but one of our most recent papers just published last year really helps us understand that these the latest coral records contain records of El Niños like the 2016, and they stand out against the background of natural variability contained in these archives. That's not what I'm going to dwell on today, other than to say that we can add it to the pile, if you will, of some of the stronger evidence that we have for links between climate extremes and ongoing warming. But I did want to talk about this experience that I lived through in real time across this El Nino event at this very remote tropical reef site, not unlike many of the tropical reefs that exist across the world and across the global oceans, and provide recreational opportunities, of course, important economic services to many countries around the tropics, and protein to over 1 billion people through the fish that these kinds of ecosystems support. So on the left, we have a picture of the kind of healthy reef that provides all those ecosystem services and forms such a critical part of the ocean's function. And on the right, we have a picture of the reef in 2016, which was devastated by these 10 months of record-breaking temperature extremes, one of the largest marine heat waves ever on record. And 2016 wiped out 80% of the corals at this particular research site that I've been working at for over 20 years. So that is what I had to witness. I had to witness that transition over 6 different expeditions that we launched across this time interval. And, you know, it changed me. It helped me realize just how close these devastating temperature extremes are, and that they're already having real world impacts today, I would say much sooner than I thought they would occur as an expert in the field. And a reminder that we're going to be creeping up against these kinds of devastating widespread losses more and more as the temperature rises every decade. And so we're just talking about the ocean here, but I wanted to, of course, really recognize some of the many incidences of wildfires and heat extremes that we're grappling with on land this summer across the entire Northern Hemisphere. And this is an image from Lytton, Canada last month. Of course, the Pacific Northwest breaking all-time records, and not by a little bit. And these kinds of heat extremes, especially in the context of extended drought, are very closely associated to record wildfires that we've had raging across British Columbia and across much of the Pacific Northwest, and now a new record-breaking fire in California, the Dixie Fire, taking the charts for the worst ever fire in California's history. And of course, in Europe, we have Greece and Turkey reeling through the wildfire catastrophes of their own. And so this is one of the kinds of climate extremes that the community has worked so hard to understand what the links are between greenhouse gases, global warming, and these kinds of devastating extremes that are in our headlines, unfortunately, every year, whether it's here in the Northern Hemisphere. Of course, Australia really devastated a couple years ago. And I wanted to plot this for us, just to look at the data for just how extreme this temperature record was that was shattered in the Pacific Northwest over this last month. And so what you see here is the kind of the seasonal march of cooler temperatures and in January and February on the left, then coming into the summer months, and then cooling back down into the Northern Hemisphere winter months. And all of those black lines are individual years, and some Mays are hotter than others. And so we get this band of of climate histories over the year. And what you can see in the red there is the evolution of temperatures over this summer and the just absolutely literally off the chart temperatures that we witnessed in Pacific Northwest this last month. So these kinds of temperature extremes are something that we know is coming. It's one of the most direct consequences of continued warming, and it doesn't have to be this extreme, but we will be seeing records broken across the world in different regions every year, unfortunately, going forward. There was a very important scientific study that was launched just days after the Pacific Northwest heat extreme occurred. And this is something that is new in our science and has really helped us advance the science of extreme events. And this is called a World Weather Attribution Group. And what they do is they assemble climate models that represent the best physics that we can put into these simulations of our Earth system. And they run the past couple days of weather with and without greenhouse gases embedded in the models. And that allows us to say just how much greenhouse gases and current warming may have tipped the scales on some of the existing weather extremes that we're living through in real time. So when they did this for the Pacific Northwest, exact conditions that led to that heat extreme, they found this. In a future, a world with 2 degrees C of global warming, which is where we're headed, this event would have been another full degree hotter. An event like this, which is currently estimated to occur only once in every 1,000 years, would occur roughly every 5 to 10 years in that future world with 2 degrees Celsius of warming. So this was a truly exceptional event, but it's made more likely by the warming that we currently have, and it's going to get a lot worse with the warming that we may have unless we make this deep and sustained greenhouse gas reductions starting right now. Enter the IPCC report that just dropped yesterday. I'm going to hit some highlights, and then I want to shift to that discussion about solutions because I can't see you all, but I can already sense some of the depression in the room. And this report is cause for alarm on the one hand, but also cause for really consolidating action and spurring us forward with the knowledge that if we act now, we can keep damages to a minimum and we can see tangible benefits of our actions today as early as 2050, when we'll begin to see the departures of the worlds that we're looking at right now on our current trajectories and the worlds that we're fighting for when we limit reduction, when we limit emissions to their lowest possible levels and lock in a reduced warming for this century. And here's what that looks like in this report. So you're looking at historical temperatures coming up from 1950 on the far left through present day. And as the gray transitions into the rainbows, you're seeing the spread of possible climate futures determined by the greenhouse gas trajectories that we walk this decade and this century. So on the high end, we're looking at emission scenarios that are consistent with about a 5 degrees Celsius warming, give or take. And on the very, very low end, which is where I want us to focus attention, because that's our job right now. That's what we're fighting for. What we can achieve, science tells us this in this report, is an additional increment of warming of about 1/2 of degrees Celsius on top of the one that we already have. Now, that's no picnic, because this report also tells us that that warming comes with a bunch of other impacts I'll get to in a minute. But I want you to see that that bottom line starts curving downwards in the latter part of the century. In other words, if we follow this trajectory in the next decade or two, we are reserving the right to do global cooling later this century. I don't know about you, but I'm willing to work very hard for that climate future. So what are the kinds of climate impacts that this report drops in our laps and into the laps of policymakers who will convene later this year to address their ambitions and lock in action on emissions reductions? We're looking at impacts in the ocean. I've marked in blue here. We've talked about sea level rise through many decades now. It's one of the most certain categories of climate change impacts. The rates and magnitudes of that will be determined in the next decades because we have choices to make. Ocean acidification, ocean deoxygenation, and marine heat waves are all part of what the report lifts up as very strong physical linkages to ongoing warming. On land, we've talked about the heat waves, with the Pacific Northwest being a horrifying example of that in our recent past. But we also have discussed extreme precipitation in the last two major assessments, 10 years of science, really helping us make our firmest conclusions yet, linking global warming to extreme precipitation around the world. This is particularly acute and noticeable in the central United States, where this signal is already apparent in the data and has emerged from the background noise. Proportion of intense tropical cyclones will increase. The number of category 4 and 5 storms has increased in recent decades, and it's unlikely to be due to natural variability. Droughts in arid regions is a biggie. This is part of the issue across the Western North America region, but it's also part of the issue in the Mediterranean. Certainly one of the contributing factors to the wildfires that are occurring in Greece and Turkey right now. Thoughts go out to all of those folks deeply impacted by these fires right now. And then the last thing to mention is, of course, the increase that the report notes in this fire-prone weather patterns. These are hot, windy, and dry conditions that are the perfect storm for the kinds of fire outbreaks that we're seeing across the world. And so one thing I wanted to note about what this is costing us, it's not just individuals' houses and lives that ended, in some cases tragically lives lost, but this is already hitting our economy to the tune of billions of dollars of damages per year, according to NOAA, which compiles this database of billion-dollar disasters every year. Now, this trend is only going one direction. It's getting worse through time, and there are a bunch of different kinds of climate extremes that are contributing to these damages. Most notably, we can see the severe storms creeping up there, as well as the impacts of tropical cyclones. But wildfires also ticking up in the orange as well. So this is one of the seminal figures from the IPCC report that just was released yesterday, and it happens to be one that appeared in chapter 1, where I contributed as a lead author to the assessment report, which means that I've done about 20 interviews in the last 24 hours. But I'm really happy to share the solutions next with you guys, which this report does not do. It really just looks at our choices and what it means for our climate futures. So here are the climate futures on the far right, as you can see. And on the very bottom, we see colors grading into orange and maybe getting a little bit cooler into the latter part of the century on the lowest emissions trajectory. That would require achieving net zero, which is that big zero black thing in the middle there, by about mid-century, net zero emissions by mid-century to achieve that goal. And up at the very top, we're looking at deep reds and blacks. We don't want to go to that world, okay? That's a 3 to 5 degrees Celsius warming this century. Kind of unthinkable from where we sit now, already reeling from the effects of 1 degree C of warming. So let's do what we can to work towards this goal that is right down here. We need to get halfway to net zero by about 2030 and the rest of the way by 2050. That is what is our charge, to limit damages for ourselves and future generations. That means we are out of time, unfortunately. We should have begun doing this decades ago when the science was very clear, but alas, here we are in the 11th hour trying to hold on for dear life and steer this tanker around in time to make sure that warming does not exceed 1.5, which is our most ambitious target in Paris. It is absolutely achievable if we enact deep, sustained emissions reductions right now. So we need to go kind of to an all of the above, all in kind of solution set. And while there is a job to do for the international policymakers who are convening later this year to chart the path towards achieving the Paris goals, there's actually an opportunity and a responsibility, I would say, for all of us to be part of the solution and to bring our organizations along with us. And the youth have been amazingly impactful in this area, championing universities to be more ambitious with their divestments, championing their state governments and their city councils to enact bold legislation, and of course, hounding the federal policymakers at every turn that they can to make sure that we are baking in climate resilience, climate justice, and low carbon energy into every law that is passed. So on the individual level in 2016, I really had this important wake-up call witnessing the demise of the coral reef that I work on. And so I was basically grasping at straws, and little did I know that I took the first step of biking to work in 2017, and it would be the first step of my personal path on a chart of zero emissions for myself and my family. And I hope to beat the Paris goals to that important signpost. Call it Mission Zero. So it basically, you can see the carbon accruing on the right here of all the different choices I've made and changes in my life since 2017 to try to align my actions with my values and talk about it as much as I can to have this kind of ripple effect beyond my own choices, so that we create new societal norms and try to check our own carbon privilege wherever possible as a relatively wealthy white person. That I feel is part of my responsibility. We can also think about taking organizations along with us, and this is a larger scope of emissions reductions. This is a program that I direct called the Carbon Reduction Challenge. We do it every spring and summer. There's a cohort racing to the finish line right now. We have our expo next week. You can check out our website, carbonreductionchallenge.org. This is where we combine student teams and they partner with organizations, large and small, to design and implement a very large-scale energy efficiency plan for the most part. And you can see the carbon accrual marching up here. Sorry, there seems to be some formatting issues there. But the carbon savings that we've been able to achieve through time is much, much, much bigger. Many, many lifetimes of my biking to work and not flying and solar panels, etc. In fact, 20 million pounds of carbon dioxide is equivalent to putting solar panels on the roofs of 35 homes and running them fully solar for over 20 years. Okay, so that's a very big deal, and we're achieving these kinds of reductions every year. You might want to ask, how are the students achieving these reductions? They're achieving these reductions because more often than not, they're making a successful business case to these organizations. They're saving them money. So this is really a part of the energy transition to our low carbon future, is reminding ourselves that we can't waste it. We can't continue to feed the beast, even if it's low carbon or zero carbon power. We have to reduce our demand as well. I'm going to give you an example of one of these projects, and then I'm happy to discuss it more in Q&A. But this is the winning team from spring. They worked with the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, and they worked with them to design and quantify the impact of a work from home program that would be institution-wide once a week. So on Fridays, they decided that their entire team would stay home and work remotely, and that they would change the thermostats and lighting schedules to account for that. They're saving their employees gas and air pollution on our choked highways here in Atlanta. And they also worked with the ACLU to design a HVAC schedule that modified the set points and the duration of heating and cooling cycles to save even more energy. So this may sound like small interventions, but these numbers on the bottom here are tens of thousands of pounds of CO2 annually. My own personal carbon footprint is something like 10,000 pounds per year. So that is a very big deal. And I'm really grateful for the work of all the students that have helped to achieve these goals and keep me getting out of bed every morning, convinced that working on the Carbon Reduction Challenge is a major part of the solution. At the state level, I've been involved with a program called Drawdown Georgia, which borrows from the mothership Project Drawdown, which if you are not familiar with that, you should get familiar with that. They have a beautiful website, drawdown.org, and you can see the global scale solution sets that will reverse global warming, technology that is all available at our fingertips right now. Drawdown Georgia takes a state lens on that and asks what we can do to achieve carbon neutrality in Georgia by 2030. And I don't want to really belabor this point, but I think it's fascinating. You have a beautiful website, drawdowngeorgia.org, and you can see the top 20 solutions listed here. And notably, many of the solutions that I've kind of outlined in black are individual level choices that, if done at scale, really moves the needle. And so this is where consumers might look to and say, well, how can my actions really add up together with other people's? And if policymakers are interested, of course, you can enact policies that would really help people make those choices more easily. So we also need to think about reducing the risks of our climate future with emissions reductions today and going forward. But in the meantime, we know we are facing at least another 0.5 degree C of warming, and that's a hotter and more dangerous world. So we need to work to keep communities safe now and going forward from this very well-known set of emerging climate impacts. And it's with this in mind that we need to think about the issue of climate justice first and foremost, at least. That's my opinion. And here is an amazing study published and featured in the New York Times in this graphic that outlines the coincidence of extreme urban heating, which is a feature of almost all major cities, and historic redlining, which is the disinvestment that communities of color have been subject to for decades now, linked to systemic racism, especially in the history of this country. And so when we think about the coincidence of extreme heat and vulnerable populations and systemic racism, this is the conversation around climate justice. And this is where we should be starting to think about keeping communities safe. So it's this project it's this idea that this project is squarely aimed at. It's called Urban Heat ATL, and it's a community science project with students from Spelman College and Georgia Tech walking around with smartphone-enabled sensors and mapping temperatures at a meter scale across Atlanta to complement the products that we have available from NASA to give us that level of neighborhood level detail about where it is hottest in Atlanta, working in partnership with the city of Atlanta to try to figure out how we can make sure that the city is aware of these most extreme of urban heat islands in Atlanta and work to keep people safe in coming years and decades. This is a great webinar if you want to go to our site, urbanheatatl.org. 30 minutes of your time, very well spent to be schooled by these experts. Don't take it from me. The next piece of solutions that we've been working on at Georgia is on our coasts with sea level rise. Coastal communities have been facing a doubling of coastal flooding just over the recent decades. This is averaged around the world. And unfortunately, Savannah is in a very tricky spot. Most of their major flooding events have occurred since 2015, as depicted by the coast's only tide gauge in Fort Pulaski. And this is where our project enters. It's called Smart Sea Level Sensors. And it has Georgia Tech designed sensors. You can see it on the left there. And they're retrieving water levels every 6 minutes across 50 different sites in the county around Savannah, Georgia, and relaying that information to emergency managers and responders to address the needs of communities during acute now term flooding today and tomorrow, and also think about providing model simulations and aggregating data together so that city planners can think about what their options are for best use of their resources in keeping communities safe over the next decades of sea level rise and intense storm activity. So thinking about solutions now and over the longer term. And this is really the bottom line for the climate change choices that we face right now. We are going to be determining the path of climate impacts that communities all across the world will be facing in 2050, and worse in 2100, and for centuries to come as the climate system fully adjusts to the emissions that we will put in the sky this decade. That is what's at stake right now. I think it's an amazing time to be alive. It's an amazing time to be digesting science and thinking about what it means for ourselves as individuals, as institutions, and as a species. So what can we do? You are here learning about it. You are passionate about it, presumably. I thank you for that. Keep the conversation going and explore low carbon choices yourself across your friends and talk about it and share the path. The other thing to do is think about that aspect of climate justice. What can we collectively do to lift up the organizations that are doing the work, that have been doing the work, to learn from them and support them as they try to address what we know is going to be the brunt of the damages falling on the shoulders of the most vulnerable among us here in Atlanta, across the United States, across North America, and of course, across the world. vote and get out the vote. There's nothing more important than that. You see my necklace actually says vote on it, and I wear it every day because this is critical. We need leaders in office who will turn to the science, like the assessment report that we just talked about, and use it to keep communities safe today and tomorrow, but also to enact the kinds of emissions reductions that are most consistent with keeping warming to that minimum level of 1.5. And then talk about it, talk about it, talk about it, talk about it. That's key. We don't talk about this enough, which sounds difficult to believe after some of the coverage yesterday, but I was on some of the major outlets for less than 3 minutes, okay? So we need to be talking about this more. These are some amazing organizations I'd like to lift up that we work closely with here in Atlanta and our work towards climate justice. And these are some books I will leave up for a second that really help get to the core issues around our climate change challenge and our climate choices going forward. All of them by amazing friends of mine and people who can bring not just the science to you, but help you understand really how to engage with it at a deep level and harness your potential for as an actor here. So with that, I will stop sharing, or maybe Jesse can bring me back, I guess, because I don't need to stop sharing. And,
yeah, so I've exited your screen share. You're back on screen. Thank you so much for that relentless optimism at the end. I love it. And the call to action for all our students. If you do want to exit screen share so you can see us, by all means, go right ahead with that. But I absolutely love not only the optimism, but you touched upon so many salient points, not just on a global scale, but on things that are really salient to Toronto kids coming in. One, you mentioned Project Drawdown. It's also a book. It's a fantastic book. I love it. It's the single best climate change book you're ever going to have. Drawdown.org, also amazing. I really encourage, like, if you're going to find one resource from all this, check that out. There's so much great information. It's such an amazing program. So, Kim, I'm bringing in Greg for a second. He's leading the call leadership team. Hey, Greg, welcome in at the zoo. Nice to have you here.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Cobb. That was a phenomenal presentation. We have all of our call participants here today. I'll just turn the screen. We have our youth participants there in the corner and some of our interns in the back. That was a lot of very useful information. Do we have any questions out of our group right now? Anyone have any initial questions? Not yet, but I do.
Go ahead.
Have questions. You talked about personal choices, personal decisions you can make. A couple of the ones you listed, obviously riding bicycle, things of that nature. I noticed one of the last ones that actually had a really outsized impact. You talked about planting trees as sort of a personal thing we can do. We often talk about deforestation as having a huge impact on the climate here, with the rainforest being the lungs of the planet. Can you touch a little bit more on like how much impact that has? Like if our youth and our interns are planting and doing things, how much of an impact does that have on reducing greenhouse gases?
Yeah.
Well, it has a pretty big impact. And so one hardwood tree is worth about 1,000 pounds of carbon dioxide. Now, that doesn't happen overnight, mind you, as we can all understand. But I'm coming to the habit of planting as many trees as I can in the growing and planting season with an organization called Trees Atlanta, which, by the way, is an amazing community that I get to be a part of through this exercise. But to me, it's important to remember that it's not just about the carbon every year that is potentially going in the ground and working over the next decades to help us out here. But it's also about remembering that on a global scale, the land biosphere is responsible for sequestering roughly 1/4 of our emissions every year. So that's kind of the services at a global scale that photosynthesis is delivering for us on land. And another 1/4 of our emissions are drawn down by photosynthesis in the ocean. So half of our emissions are sucked up every year by photosynthesis. So anything we can do to preserve the forests that we already have that are doing this amazing service for us, not hopefully get the fires to such an extent that we're losing so many forests year on year, which is a huge contribution to emissions, by the way. That's a pretty big deal. Global deforestation is responsible alone for 10 to 15% of the emissions we put up in the sky every year. So we're kind of turning the knob the wrong way, as you alluded to there, Greg. But with respect to the other benefits that trees can deliver to our own near neighborhood environments, we can list several other important benefits that are directly related to climate change. One is they have a strong and well-documented cooling effect on their near environments. And so when you get especially canopies that are, or trees that are covering roughly 40% or more of an aerial view of a given place, you are achieving dramatic cooling effects for that environment. That's critical in these urban areas where we have lost, of course, most of our trees through time. The second thing that they do is they actually improve drainage. They can remove excess rainfall from, let's say, extreme precipitation that has just been linked to warming, and help sequester it in the soils and subsurface, and do a much better job than impervious surfaces, of course, which are going to consolidate those extreme precipitation events into potential flooding, especially in urban environments. And the third thing they do, which is really important, which is, I think, very relevant for Toronto Zoo, is, of course, help the ecosystem function through these climate extremes by enhancing biodiversity and enhancing ecological resilience. And so obviously that goes to both the temperature effects, the precipitation effects, but also the habitat that they provide, and in many cases, the ecosystem services that they provide to a very large number of species that depend on tree canopy for their to thrive. So those are all the reasons why we need to keep planting trees. It's never going to be enough, but we need to stop cutting down the trees that we are cutting down, because that's moving in the wrong direction. We need to continue to plant trees, especially in urban environments where they can deliver tangible, documented benefits, both to humans and critters alike.
What a fantastic and detailed answer. That was the best for that question I've ever heard. I want to add a few things to it for Greg and for the call team. In Canada, we have the 2 billion trees campaign by the Canadian government right now, so you guys can all look this up. Dr. Cobb, of course, was talking about work being done in Georgia. If you're keen to take action in Canada, that's a fantastic initiative. And another world-class tree planting initiative is the Great Green Wall across sub-Saharan Africa to block the Sahara from literally moving south. So another tangible benefit of this is providing habitat, ecosystem, food for people, millions and millions of people across East and Southern Africa. So it's a really, really special project if you guys get a chance to highlight that. You also talked about something in your presentation that I've never heard anyone mention in the history of Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, which is climate justice. And you talked about this on an Atlanta level. In Toronto, this is a really tangible thing. I grew up in Rexdale. I know we've got some students here probably from the Scarborough area in and around the zoo. And if you walk through those neighborhoods, there's a lot fewer trees than there are in richer neighborhoods. This is something that you guys can see and actually take action on. Go and even measure temperature in those areas compared to somewhere near High Park, somewhere in Yorkville, somewhere near the beaches for our Toronto kids, and see that difference. And so it's so important to think of it through that lens and pitch it through that lens to help make positive action happen. So I'm so glad you brought that up. Greg, are there any of the students that have any questions? And we've also got our YouTube folks tuning in, so if people do want to share any questions, they can do it there, but go ahead.
We do have one question in the back. Maybe, do you mind coming up, Noel? So one of our interns has a question. I'll just get her to come on the screen.
Come on in.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi. I was just wondering, you mentioned that you worked in the heart of the El Nino in the tropical Pacific, and what I was wondering was, what was kind of the most jarring thing to see as a result of climate change?
Yeah.
What was the last part of the question there? Was the most jarring thing to see?
Sorry, it's the most jarring thing you saw when you were in that region, sort of based on climate change, the biggest climate impact that was really quite shocking to you personally.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke about that a little bit, what it felt like to jump out of the boat in that morning of our expedition in April 2016, and to just look down at the reef that I know like the back of my hand, and to have it completely erased and covered over by these red-brown algae that are wafting in the currents down below. And so what was once a vibrant and colorful reef full of all kinds of structure and nooks and crannies had just been wiped out and completely made uniform. And so I didn't even need to go down to the bottom to see the devastation from the surface. And, it was something that I had feared may happen to that reef in the next decades as ocean temperatures continue to warm. I know that as a scientist that's almost a certainty. I just didn't expect it to happen so quickly. And so what for me is important to take home about this is that, scientists are people too. We have emotions. We get surprised, even seeing things that somewhere in our brain we knew were probably going to happen. It's different. It really hit home for me, and it made me personally question what I was doing with my life, trying to find more and more and more answers to what was wrong with climate change and how it's going to be impacting us, and start to pour my energy more and more after that expedition into climate solutions and change my entire personal life and bring my institution along with me and conduct my entire research program in climate solutions, which is basically what I'm doing right now. So it was a surprise to see the reef dead, even though intellectually I knew that was probably going to be the case when I went on that expedition because of the duration and extent of warming. But it's something that I still is one of the worst moments for me personally as somebody who's living through accelerated climate change.
Yeah, I'm really glad, it sounds so simple to think that scientists are people, but I'm really glad that you brought that up. And I think the scale of this and the speed at which it's happened was really shocking. When I was a kid, people talked about climate change. Oh, we'll start to see the impacts in 2050, 2100. And it's happening now. I mean, our kids in Toronto, you've seen there's major flooding every year in the city. The lake rises. We've got, fires all across Canada. Like, these things are happening way faster and way bigger than we ever sort of anticipated. And I think that it underscores the responsibility we all have to take action. And I'm glad we've got some questions along that front so far. Dr. Cobb, this has been fantastic. I want to turn it back to Greg for one last question. I know you've probably got some more interviews to give based on your report. But Greg, if you want to share one more question with us to wrap us up before we go, come on in.
Do we have one more question?
And if not, I've got a good one that came in online, if it helps.
One more. Okay, great. I love to see questions. Thank you so much.
So there are people who still don't really understand the full impacts of climate change. What can just regular people do to try and educate those people who maybe don't think climate change is as serious as it really is, or anything like that? What can we do to kind of educate those people in a more simple manner?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, this is such an important conversation. And I think it really starts with that word I just used, a conversation. And to think about, what do they care about already? And this is something that Catherine Hayhoe, my colleague, talked extensively about in her TED Talk, which you can look up on this very point, please. And maybe Jesse can drop the link. But she talks about the importance. The data are very clear. When we talk about it, when we learn from the person that we are connecting with, whether it's a family or a friend, and we ask them, what kinds of things do you care about? Guaranteed, whatever they care about, climate change is already impacting that. Whether it's national security, read the Department of Defense reports, which are some of the leading information in the federal government, the earliest people to respond to climate change, Department of Defense. Whether it's the ecosystems of the world and their beauty and glory in our national parks, those are under threat. Whether it's their kids or grandkids, those are under threat. Whether it's our economy, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars per year in damages. So whatever it is that they care about, it's already under threat by climate change. And together, we can turn it around and limit future damages. Part of the problem is everybody's just like, it's just too late. It just doesn't make a difference. It is not too late, and it will make a pile of difference as soon as 20 years from now. So keep telling that message too. The science is very clear on that point. If we work now, we can keep warming to 1.5 degrees. And if we let her rip and throw our hands up, we will be sitting in a very much hotter, much more dangerous world in 2050. And that's a choice that we will make collectively in the next years.
Dr. Cobb, thank you so much for this. It's been such a special program. You mentioned Catherine Hayo's TED Talk, so I have put that in the YouTube chat bar, and I'll bring up Catherine Hayo if you guys want to check her out. If you're at home tuning in, it's an amazing program. I've seen the TED Talk. It's awesome. I really encourage you to check it out. And one of the books that I can actually bring up on your screen share again, we have by Catherine, right on the bottom there, Saving Us. I'll take off the banner there. Saving Us, Climate Scientist Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World. Check that out as well. It's an amazing read. This has been a really special program, and so I'll bring Greg back in to say a farewell and thank you. But whole team, Greg, thank you so much for helping organize this. Has been such a special afternoon, and yeah, thanks guys.
We really appreciate you taking the time, and also the message of positivity, what they can do. There's so much that our interns and youth can take and fold into their community-based projects, and we just can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for your time.
Nice.
Thanks for having me. And tthanks to all the students who are dedicated to this issue. Keep at it. We'll get there.
Climate action, learning, and leadership. These are our future leaders. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and have